Good morning, everybody. We are going to be looking at the class changes for October 8th, which is today that we are releasing this video. There are a few changes that happened actually yesterday at the last second before they're actually being implemented. I will cover them. I may not say which ones were added. I only read a few specifically that I actually remember, but we're going to get into it. And let's start with PvE, and then we're going to break down PvP. There are a few nerfs to PvP, for example, the Unholy DK and the Affliction Warlock. So stay tuned for those. If you actually want to jump to your class, I do have the time codes down below. Alright, starting off with Death Knight Blood. Sandland, Vampiric Strike, damage is increased by 30%. Infliction of Sorrow now deals 20% of the remaining disease damage enemy when extends its duration. Infliction of Sorrow now deals 130% of the remaining disease damage to the enemy when it consumes. Visual Strength now grants 12% strength for 12 seconds, and Frenzied Bloodthirst now increases the damage of Death Strike by 6%. So overall, Blood is getting a damage increase, and just take note that if it does not say does not affect PvP combat, this will increase the PvP stance on it as well. Just a smidge. It does go into a lot of factors with how it actually plays out overall with percentage increase. So throughout this class tuning, looks like tanks are actually getting a buff, just FYI. We've got Demon Hunter, Havoc, the Aldrachi Reaver, wounded quarry damage is increased by 100%, Warblade's Hunger increased by 100%, and Reaver's Glaive damage increased by 15%. I think it's much needed for Demon Hunter. I think they're lacking this expansion, and they're so fun to play as far as a melee class and how mobile they are. I'm glad that they're actually getting a damage increase. Next up, we got Vengeance. Mastery Fell Blood effectiveness is increased by 20%. Shattered Soul's healing per soul is increased to 7%. And Soul Barrier base absorb value is increased by 50%. Absorb value per soul is increased by 100%. So they're getting a lot of more extra self-healing overall for Vengeance. Next up, we got Druid, Feral, the Windstalker. Chance for Bloodseeker Vines to grow on a single target is unchanged, but slightly increased when Rip and Rake are on multiple targets. Then we got Windstalker, bursting growth damage increased by 10%, so slight buff to Feral for PvE. Resto, all healings increased by 5%. This does not affect PvP combat, though I think it should. And then Cenarion, ward healing increased by 40%. So Resto's getting into a better spot. I think they're kind of lackluster as far as a healer this expansion. Even though they've been the GOAT for quite some time, I still would like to see them being the GOAT. That's just me. Next up, we got Evoker Augmentation. Blistering Scales grants allies 20% of your armor, was 30, so it was a slight nerf, nothing too crazy, and plus Blistering Scales isn't that game-changing, so slight nerf, but you're probably not going to be able to even see it. Devastation, we got Flame Shaper. Consume flame damage is increased by 25%, and engulf damage reduced by 20% in PvP combat. So slight nerf and buff to Flame Shaper, but I don't know if anybody's actually playing Flame Shaper over Scale Commander. I think Scale Commander is the kind of go-to heroic talent, especially when I play my Evoker. That's what I'm playing. We got Preservation, Flame Shaper again, engulf healing increased by 20%, and consume flame healing reduced by 50%. But like I said, I don't think Flame Shaper is the kind of go-to heroic talent, so I don't think it's really going to be that important unless you play Flame Shaper, obviously. But slight nerf and buff to them. Now we got Hunter, Beastmaster. We got Basilisk, collar damage increased by per damage, overtime effect reduced to 2 and 4%, and kill command damage increased by 18%. All damage dealt by you and your pet abilities increased by 8%. This was one of the changes that happened overnight, and that was added, so they're getting a good PvE, and this will correlate to PvP slightly as far as what their damage will look like. I think they do need it. I think Beast Mastery is fun, even though a lot of people think it's boring because of the rotation. I personally like it. I like the style of it, and I'm glad that this is actually happening. So I am tempted to try that out. Next up, we got Survival. We got their 2-set bonus. Now increases Wildfire Bomb damage by 8%, and their 4-set now increases Raptor Strike Mongoose by damage by 20% on targets afflicted by Wildfire Bomb. So slight buff to their 4-set and 2-set. Next up, we got Mage, and I love this, but I hate it at the same time, and I'll explain why. So Frostfire Bolt damage is increased by 15%. Frostfire Infusion damage increased by 50%. Frostfire Empowerment damage increased by 60%. Frostfire Mastery now grants 2% of Mastery. So here's the reason why I love it and I hate it. I love Frostfire Mage. It's phenomenal. I'm glad that they're getting a buff. That's what I love. The downside is I don't really care for the casting type of Frost Fire Mage the way it's kind of going. I love the beginning of the expansion where it was just straight insta-cast and all that. I think a lot of people have complained that it's too strong because of the insta-casts, but personally, I think it was in a good spot. I think it takes a good mage to survive, but they are getting a buff overall, so I'm really curious. I'm going to have to try that out on my mage again. We're looking at the Monk, Heroic Talents, Mastery of Harmony. Stored Vitality causes an additional 40% healing and damage, was 25, so slight increase for Master of Harmony Heroic Talent. And then we got Brewmaster, Mastery of Harmony, Coalescence Now. Coalescence Now causes Aspect of Harmony to increase damage and healing by 20%. Master of Harmony Chi Wave Chi Burst deals 100% increased damage. Overwhelming Force increased to 20%. And Balanced Stratagem increases the damage to 5%. So slight increase buff to the Brewmaster Monk. If you play this Heroic Talent tree, it's looking pretty good for you. And like I said, tanks are probably going to be receiving a lot of increases, it kind of looks like, to balance them. And then we got Mistweaver, Master of Harmony, fix an issue that caused Coalescence not to increase healing damage taken during Aspect of the Harmony. And Coalescence now causes Aspect of the Harmony to increase damage and healing taken by 20%, so slight nerf here, but in a bug fix, so nothing too crazy. Aspect of the Harmony now stores 30% of healing done, was 20, so you got a little nerf. So just a little bit of a balancing issue for Mistweaver, that's about it. Next up we got Windwalker, Conduit of the Celestials. Celestial Conduit now scales its damage with Mastery Combo Strikes. So if you're not familiar with Windwalker, you can talent into their Combo Strikes Mastery to get up to like 6% increased damage. This is just going to scale with that. So at most it's going to be 6% increase to Celestial Conduit. Now here we got a lot of changes for Holy and Prot Pally down here. I love Holy. I'm glad that they're getting a better limelight, in my opinion. As a healer, I don't feel like they've been in the best situation in the past couple expansions. But going into Holy, Lightsmith. Awakening now causes Blessing of the Forge to spawn a sacred weapon when extending the duration of Avenging Wrath. Hammer and Anvil's healing effect radius is increased to 20 yards. Hammer and Anvil's healing is increased by 150%. Divine Guidance effect increased by 50%. They have this one line here, all healing reduced by 5% and does not affect PvP combat. They removed that because the healing is actually needs that 5% in my opinion. Like I said, I don't think they're that strong right now, but I think they're going to be a strong healer later on. We got Dawnlight healing increased by 30%, and they also fixed a bug to Dawnlight not having its healing reduced beyond 5 targets. Next up, we got Prot. All ability damage increased by 6%. Word of Glory healing increased by 20%. Light of the Titans now heals for over 10 seconds. Faith in the Light duration increased to 6 seconds. Lightsmith, Sacred Weapon, and healing is increased by 30%. Forge Reckoning damage increased by 30%. Blessed Assurance increases the damage of the next Crusader Strike Hammer Righteous or Blessed Hammer by 200%. Divine Guidance damage and healing increased by 50%. Hammer and Anvil damage increased by 40%. And Sanctification grants 2% increased primary stat, was 1. So, like I said, tanks are getting a major tuning in my opinion, especially with Prot. I'm glad Prot is actually getting tuning because it's obviously the most underutilized tank at the moment for PvE. So them getting this buff hopefully puts them in a better spot to be actually selected. Next up we got Rhett. Now, Rhett with Templar, I think Herald of the Sun is still going to be the go-to heroic talent, but this actually gives it a good damage boost for single target, so I'm going to be interested to actually try this out. So we're looking at Shake of the Heavens, lasts for 10 seconds. Sanctification, duration is increased to 12. Final Reckoning now increases the damage of Hammer of Light by 30%. Hammer of Light main target damage increased by 25%. Hammer of Light secondary target increased by 75%. And Light's Deliverance now triggers at 50 stacks. Undisputed Ruling grants 15% haste for 8 seconds, and Wrathful Descent now deals 125% of the Empyrean Hammer damage to nearby targets, and an Empyrean Hammer now benefits from Penitence and Burn to Ash. So like I said, single target damage is getting increased for the Rat Pally. None of this says that it does not affect PvP combat, so I'm actually going to be tempted to try Templar in PvP over Herald of the Sun, because I liked Templar a lot more when the bug allowed you to consistently hit Hammer of Lights out. I think that bug should be reverted, but that's just me. Next up, we're looking at Priest, Shadow. Now, Shadow is one of those specs that are just already insane in my opinion for PvE and PvP, and they're just getting more damage baked into it, which is kind of insane. I don't think they need it. If y'all want to argue that all day, I will. Go down in the comments. Mind Blast. Damage is increased by 10%. Shadow Word Death damage is increased by 10%. Void Bolt damage is increased by 10%. Shadowy Apparition damage increased by 10%. So huge buffs all around. Not huge, I wouldn't say huge, but a good damage buff to something that I think they don't need. Void Weaver. Entropic damage Rift is increased by 10%. Void Blast damage increased by 20%. Collapsing Void damage increased by 10%. Void Flay damage increased by 10%. And Inner Quietus now increases Vampiric Touch, Shadow Word Pain damage by 25%. I don't think this is that big of a deal. I don't think Void Weaver is the go-to heroic talent. I could be wrong, but if you're playing that talent tree, cool, you're getting a buff. But even outside that talent tree, you're still getting a buff. And like I said, it affects PvP combat because it doesn't state if it is or isn't. So assume that it is. We got Rogue, heroic talents. We got Deathstalker, Follow the Blood effect now requires 2 targets afflicted with Rupture. Down was 3, so not that big of a deal. We got Assassination, Caustic Spatter, poison damage dealt to nearby targets is reduced by 40%. And their 2-set bonus is chance to trigger Vile Tincture is increased, and 2-set bonus again, Vile Tincture poison damage buff now correctly affects Envenom, Kingsbane, inappropriate heroic talents. Got their 4-set bonus, Thrombotic Tincture now correctly applies upon gaining 5 stacks of Vile Tincture. So overall, just kind of like I would say a buff and nerf at the same time. Nothing too great. Actually, I wouldn't say nerf at all, actually. Just their first one there. But doesn't change Assassination. They're still strong. It's not going to change much in my opinion. Outlaw. Outlaw's a sleeper spec. I'm going to say it. I say it every time I do one of these tuning changes. Outlaw, they keep getting these little buffs here and there. And I think in the right hands, they're extremely strong. And if you play Outlaw and you're not that good with it, well, get better because they're still really strong in my opinion. All their ability damage is increased by 4%. Dispatch damage is increased by 6%. Precise Cuts bonus to Blade Fury damage per missing target is increased to 4%. So overall, Outlaw's getting a buff. And like I said, they're already strong. You got Sub, Black Powder damage increased by 35%, so they're getting a small buff to their AoE, just a little bit. Next up we got Shaman, Resto. Earth and Harmony now causes Earth Shield to reduce damage taken by 3%, and Acid Rain, it says Raid, I could be wrong, but I think it's Rain damage reduced by 20%. I don't know if people are really actually running that, but that's a nerf overall to Resto. Warlock, Demonology, Pact of the Irid, and Doom Guards deal 20% increased damage. Grimoire, Felguard now increases the damage of the summon. Felguard was 60%. Felguard damage is increased by 10%, and Gloomhound's Gloom / damage increased by 20%. So Demonology is getting a nerf overall, nothing too crazy. I still think that there's better options to play over Demonology. They're just the lackluster spec as of right now. I think people that are playing them are just like dedicated to that spec specifically. Warrior, heroic talents, Colossus Arterial Bleed causes Colossal Might to increase the damage dealt by deep wounds and Rend by 3% per stack. Colossus, No Stranger to Pain, increases total damage ignored by Ignore Pain by 20%. Mountain Thane, Lightning Strikes damage increased by 25%. Ground Current damage increased by 25%. Thorum's Might causes lightning strikes to generate 3 rage. Thorum's Might increases Revenge, Raging Blow, execute damage by 25%. And Slayer Coaling Cyclone bonus damage for Blade Storm is reduced by 10%. Opportunist now increases the damage and critical strike damage of your next overpower or raging blow by 20%. So Slayer's overall is getting a slight nerf, nothing crazy. Mount Thing is getting a buff, and Colossus is getting a slight buff as well for their heroic talents. For Warrior, next up we got looking at Fury itself. 2-set, their Bloodthirst increases the damage of your next rampage by 15%. This does not affect PvP combat. And their 4-set, when Raging Blow resets its cooldown, the damage of your next Bloodthirst is increased by 20%, stacking up to 2 times. This does not affect PvP combat as well. Mountain Thane, Crashing Thunder causes Thunderclap to generate 8 rage, and Mountain Thane's Strength of Mountain increases Bloodthirst and Rampage damage by 30%. I don't think people are playing Mountain Thane as Fury anyway, so it's really nothing that crazy. Then we got Prot, Mountain Thane, Thunderblast generates 8 rage. So overall, they're just getting a minor tuning to Fury. Now we're getting to the meat and potatoes, the one that I actually care about. Player versus player. So we're looking at Death Knights. So like I said in the beginning, Unholy's getting a nerf. It is much needed, though my partner is an Unholy Death Knight, and I don't want to see that happen. But at the same time, Death Knights are insane, especially with their spread damage. If they're hooked up with an Affliction lock, they're just insane. You're never going to beat that comp, especially for the Disc Priest, because they're insane too. They need a nerf, and they're not even listed in here. So if you're a Disc Priest looking for some changes, they ain't here. But looking at Unholy, we got Death Coil damage, Virulent Plague, Frost Fever damage, and Blood Plague damage. It's all reduced by 15%. That's a pretty big nerf in PvP for DKs, because I don't think DKs like in damage is really that insane, though at the same time their burst is kind of crazy. I think they do need it. They are extremely strong, but overall, yeah, they're getting a nerf. I'm sorry, Unholy DKs. Then we got Demon Hunter, Havoc. All ability damage is increased by 4% in PvP combat, and Immolation Aura damage increased by 13.6% in PvP combat. Immolation Aura really isn't that big damage dealer, but okay, that's just a big increase. And then we got this 4%. That's what we need for Demon Hunters, in my opinion. I think they are lackluster in PvP right now. They're not like they were in Dragonflight at all, but overall, they do need it, so good on them. They got that buff. Next up, we're looking at Druid, Feral, Ferocious Wounds. Now decreases maximum health by 3% per stack, was 5%, so slight tuning, nothing that you're actually going to be able to tell if there's a difference. Ferals, Druids are one that do need a nerf in my opinion at this point. They're actually extremely strong, they're very tanky, they're great with off heals, they're just all around a good spec right now in PvP, probably one of the top specs in the game. We got Resto, Tranquility increasing by 30%. And I want to talk about this in a second, but we got mana regeneration now reduced by 40% in PvP combat. So Tranquility used to be that oh shit button, I'm going to heal everybody, and it just seems very lackluster nowadays. But I think they're trying to buff it to the point where maybe it is that oh shit button again, which I think they need as a Resto Druids, because they are kind of the meh healer right now. They used to be the GOAT, and hopefully this kind of brings them back around, especially for Blitz. They're going to be insane with this Tranquility healing. So good on them, they got a buff. Hunter, looking at Survival of the Fittest, now provides 25% damage reduction in PvP combat, was 30. Survival Tactics now has a 2-second duration, and it was 3. That's for this spec itself, that's not a specific spec, that's just all for all 3 specs here. Heroic Talents, Dark Ranger, Smokescreen now applies Survival of the Fittest at 50% in PvP combat. And we got Sentinel, Don't Look Back, effectiveness reduced by 50% in PvP combat. I don't think anybody's using Sentinel anyways, so that's a nerf though overall, and for Dark Ranger I think most people are playing this anyways. I do think Survival, well I would say Hunter in general, is in a really good spot PvP. Some specs have great burst, some specs have great sustain, and the other specs have better defensives over others. So I think overall they don't really need to be played with too much, so slight nerf in their damage reduction for all 3 classes, or all 3 specs. Nothing crazy though. Next up we got Mage. Frigid Winds is now 50% effective in PvP combat, and that's for all 3 specs. And we're looking at Arcane. Arcane Missiles damage increased by 35% in PvP combat, and Arcane Orb damage is increased by 40% PvP combat. So they're getting a buff, and I don't think Arcane Mage really needs it. They already one-shot you practically every time their cooldowns come up, and they just go ham. So if you're playing against a Arcane Mage, you better pop some defensives real quick, because they will just burst you, especially if they have their partner going in on you at the same time, or you need to lock them down quick as shit. And if you're an Arcane Mage, congratulations. Fire. Fire is going to be kind of like lackluster again. One of the specs that there's just 2 other better specs to play over Fire. But we're looking at Pyroblast damage is increased by 20%, Fireball damage increased by 150, Scorch damage increased by 300, Ignite damage increased by 15, World in Flames PvP talent now increases Flame Strike damage by 50%, was 100. I don't think anybody's really playing that I'm aware of. And then we're looking at Glass Cannon, now decreases health by 30% and increases the damage done by Scorch, Fireball, and Ignite by 20%. So all these are getting that damage increase, and it looks like for Glass Cannon, you're sacrificing more health for 10% less damage. I don't know if that's going to be viable. That kind of sucks in my opinion, because Fire's already in a terrible spot. I feel like they should have just left the Glass Cannon and seen how well it does after that, because you don't really see any Fire Mages ever. But overall, they're getting a buff to their overall damage. Shaman's Healing Stream Totem net healing is increased by 15%. This goes for all 3 specs, not just 1 spec. Elemental, looking at Lightning Bolt, damage is increased by 15%, Chain Lightning damage increased by 15%, and Tempest damage increased by 15%. If anybody has played a Lightning build Elemental Shaman, they can one-shot people. I mean, they're already strong, and that's if you don't get on them. If you let them burst, they're gonna burst you. It's kind of crazy. So they're getting a damage buff to that. It's kind of a little bit scarier if they pop everything all at once, but I think a fire build overall is still going to be the way to go, just because it's great sustain overall, and their burst windows are much shorter than what a lightning burst kind of goes for. Then we got Resto Shaman. Healing Wave is increased by 10%, and Healing Surge increased by 10%. I don't think they need this. Personally, I think Resto Shamans were is one of the strongest healers out there right now, especially with all their utility. If they know how to use their defensive capabilities well, you're going to have an easy time, in my opinion. So them getting an increase to their healing overall, cool. Warlocks. The effectiveness of Demon Skin's armor bonus is no longer reduced in 50%, so they're just becoming more tanky. Great. And Demonic Resilience now reduces the damage taken by your primary pet by an additional 67% in PvP combat. And then we're looking at Affliction. This is what I'm excited for mainly. Malevolent Visionary damage reduced by 30%. Shadow Bolt Volley damage reduced by 25%. Looking at Soul Harvester, Wicked Reaping damage reduced by 20%. Soul Anathema damage reduced by 20%. And Demonic Soul damage reduced by another 20%. So Affliction is one of those classes that are just extremely strong right now. I mean, overall, any comp, it doesn't matter. They're going to go in and just start wrecking everything because the amount of spread damage they get. I think their dots should have got reduced, but they're looking more so at their burst potential right here with Shadow Bolt Volley. That already does a lot of damage, so we'll kind of see that their burst may drop a little bit, but overall, it's a nerf, so I'll take it. Demonology. Demon Bolt damage is increased by 40%. Okay, once again, Demonology is one of the specs that there's just two better specs to play than Demonology, so they can buff them all day. I don't think it's really going to change much unless they just turn them into one-shot cannons, but that ain't going to happen more than likely. Next up, we got Warrior. Defensive Stance now reduces damage taken by 15%, so that's a bit of a buff. Arms, Execute damage is increased by 15%. Mortal Strike damage increased by 55%. And Master Commander now reduces the cooldown of Rallying Cry by 120 seconds and increases the effect by an additional 10%. And then Prot, Execute damage increased by 15%. If you're playing Prot, you're weird, don't do that. Unless you're playing Blitz, okay, I understand. Arms getting a buff is not a surprise. Everyone's playing Fury. Fury is still strong, viable. I don't think this is going to change the outcome between those two specs. I think Arms is actually still pretty strong overall, so just getting a bit of more buff. But I think Fury is still going to be the PvP spec to play overall. Let me know what you guys think about the changes that Blizzard implemented. A couple changes, like I said, happened yesterday, so there are a few new things for a couple classes just to be aware of. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. And like always, have a good one.